June 1942. The Pacific lies vast and silent, a mirror of steel and sunlight stretching beyond the horizon. Above it, a single Japanese reconnaissance plane cuts through thin clouds, its observer squinting through binoculars. The man has seen too much ocean, too little enemy. For months, the Imperial Japanese Navy has ruled these waters. America's carriers, they believed, were gone, burned, broken, sunk beneath Midway's blue depths. The pilot adjusts his heading. Then, on the distant line between sky and sea, something shifts. Faint, almost unreal. Plumes of exhaust. A dark silhouette against the light. Another, and another. Carriers. American carriers. They were not supposed to exist. Static crackles in his headset as he radios the coordinates. In Tokyo, staff officers would soon lean over maps in disbelief. The enemy that was supposed to be dead was moving again. What the Japanese pilots witnessed that day was not just the return of ships. It was the rebirth of an entire navy. A question now echoed across the Pacific. How had the Americans come back so soon after Midway? In the winter of 1941, Japan stood on the edge of triumph. The attack on Pearl Harbor had struck with surgical precision, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single morning of fire. Battleships lay overturned in oily water. The air reeked of burning steel and cordite. For Tokyo, it seemed that America's naval power, the one force capable of challenging Japan's imperial ambitions, had been erased. In the months that followed, Japan expanded in every direction. From the Philippines to Malaya, from the Dutch East Indies to the Solomon Islands, the rising sun advanced almost without resistance. Imperial Navy pilots, trained to perfection and guided by years of doctrine, dominated the skies. Their aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the heart of a naval juggernaut no other nation in the Pacific could match. To the Japanese command, this was destiny fulfilled. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, believed that Japan had 6 months to force the United States to the negotiating table. 6 months before American industrial power could awaken. It was a race against time, and Japan seemed to be winning. By early 1942, the Imperial Navy's carrier forces had grown almost mythic in their reputation. At the Coral Sea, they halted the Allied push toward New Guinea. Even though Shokaku and Zuikaku were damaged, Japan had proven that carrier warfare, not battleships, would decide the Pacific. Across Tokyo's military circles, confidence bordered on arrogance. America was seen as brave but slow, lacking the discipline and technical mastery of Japan's naval air arm. Still, Yamamoto was uneasy. He understood the scale of the American industrial machine, its foundries, its manpower, its assembly lines that could outbuild entire empires. For him, victory at Midway was meant to be the knockout blow before that machine could awaken. The plan was audacious. Lure the remaining U.S. carriers into a trap near a small atoll named Midway, crush them completely, and secure the Pacific for a generation. But hidden beneath the surface of Japan's victories were small cracks, signs that would soon widen into catastrophe. American codebreakers in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had already deciphered portions of Japan's naval communications. They knew that AF meant Midway. They knew the date, the timing, the ships involved. While Japan believed it was the hunter, it had already become the hunted. As May turned to June 1942, Task Force 16 and Task Force 17, the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, sailed quietly toward the point of ambush. Each ship bore the scars of earlier battles, but their crews were hardened now, their tactics sharper. Pilots who had once feared Japan's S-0 fighters were learning how to fight them, not in circles of agility, but with surprise, teamwork, and altitude. When the two forces met north of Midway, it was not Japan's masterstroke, but its unraveling. Within 5 hours, the pride of the Imperial Navy was burning. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all 4 carriers that had led the strike on Pearl Harbor, were destroyed by American dive bombers from the very carriers Japan believed it had already eliminated. The shock in Tokyo was indescribable. In one day, Japan lost not just ships, but its best air crews, its tactical cohesion, and its sense of invincibility. The mighty Kido Butai, the carrier strike force that had dominated half the Pacific, ceased to exist. In the aftermath, Japan's naval leadership tried to mask the scale of the loss. To the public, Midway was downplayed as a minor setback, but inside the Imperial Navy, officers whispered in disbelief. How could 4 of the Empire's greatest carriers be destroyed in a single morning? And more importantly, could America possibly recover from its own losses faster than Japan could replace hers? Those doubts would grow in the months ahead, as whispers reached Japanese pilots of something impossible. New American carriers being spotted in places where none should exist. In the weeks after Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy entered a strange silence. Official communiques spoke of partial losses, of a battle that had cost both sides dearly. But the truth, known only to a few senior officers, was far darker. The Kido Butai, the once invincible carrier strike force, was gone. 4 of Japan's frontline carriers lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Akagi, the flagship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, consumed by flames. Kaga and Soryu, hit within minutes by waves of American dive bombers. Hiryu, the last to fight, launching one final desperate strike before meeting the same fate. Each ship carried irreplaceable veterans, men trained through years of discipline and combat. The Imperial Navy could not rebuild that experience, no matter how many new planes were rolled out of the factories in Nagoya or Yokosuka. To Japan, the loss was more than material. It was psychological. The Empire had moved through the Pacific like a force of nature, undefeated since the outbreak of war. Now, for the first time, the illusion of perfection had been broken. But in Tokyo's war rooms, few dared speak of it aloud. Admiral Yamamoto accepted the responsibility in silence. His own plan had failed, not through lack of courage, but through overconfidence in intelligence that had been outplayed. The Americans, he realized too late, had read Japan's moves like an open book. Still, Yamamoto remained convinced that the United States had suffered equally. The Japanese believed they had sunk 2 or even 3 American carriers at Midway. Reports from returning pilots spoke of hits, explosions, and plumes of smoke. In truth, only 1 carrier, Yorktown, had been lost. This false assumption shaped the months that followed. Tokyo's naval staff concluded that America's remaining carrier strength was negligible, perhaps even non-existent. Japan's strategy after Midway rested on that belief. With its main carrier fleet destroyed, the Imperial Navy sought to rebuild and consolidate, assuming the Americans would need at least a year to recover. They were wrong. What Japan did not fully grasp was the scale and speed of American shipbuilding. Even as Midway raged, new carriers were already sliding down the ways at Newport News, Brooklyn, and San Francisco. The U.S. Navy's industrial surge was not measured in months, but in weeks. Shipyards worked day and night, powered by a wartime economy that seemed endless. By August 1942, barely 2 months after Midway, the carriers Enterprise and Hornet had been repaired and redeployed. And then came something unexpected: new vessels joining the fight. The Saratoga re-entered service. Wasp returned from the Atlantic, and the brand-new Essex-class carriers were already in construction, designed to replace losses faster than Japan could even train pilots. Meanwhile, the Imperial Navy was slowing down. Its replacement carriers, like Shinano and Taiho, would take years to complete. Resources grew scarce. Aluminum and aviation fuel were rationed. Training programs shortened. Veteran instructors were dead. leaving inexperienced cadets to fill the cockpits once flown by masters. To the Japanese high command, this imbalance was invisible, at least for a time. They believed the Americans had been crippled, unable to project power so soon after Midway. So when, in late 1942, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported the presence of U.S. carriers supporting landings in the Solomon Islands, disbelief spread through the ranks. The reports were dismissed at first, then verified, then feared. "How can this be?" a staff officer in Rabaul reportedly asked. "They should have none left." For Japanese pilots preparing to launch from Shokaku and Zuikaku, the sight of American carriers steaming off Guadalcanal was almost surreal. These were not ghosts. They were rebuilt, rearmed, and angrier than ever. The illusion of American weakness, born in the triumph of Pearl Harbor and sustained through the arrogance of Midway, was shattering before their eyes. And for the first time in the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy found itself not hunting, but hunted. In the coming months, the Solomons would become the crucible where this new reality took form. Japan still had skill, still had courage, but America now had momentum, machines, and an industrial will that could not be sunk. The reappearance of the U.S. carriers was not a miracle. It was the sound of a nation awakening. And soon the Japanese pilots who once ruled the skies would face a truth more terrifying than defeat. The enemy they thought they had destroyed was just getting started. For the Japanese naval aviators of 1942, flying over the Pacific had once been a ritual of confidence. Every carrier launch was a testament to discipline and mastery, a ballet of precision that the world envied. These were not ordinary men. They were the elite of the elite, graduates of a training system so rigorous that only 1 in 5 ever earned pilots' wings. But after Midway, that confidence began to erode. The pilots returning from that battle had witnessed the destruction of everything they believed invincible. The decks they once called home, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were gone. Their friends had perished in walls of flame and sea. And as months passed, those who survived faced a torment far quieter than the roar of battle: uncertainty. Then came the reports. American carriers sighted in the Solomons, again off Guadalcanal, then near Santa Cruz. At first, disbelief, then unease. "It is impossible," one pilot reportedly said to another before launch. "They cannot have built new carriers so soon." But they had. And when those pilots took off and saw the silhouettes on the horizon, the outlines of flight decks they thought were gone forever, the shock was personal, not strategic. For men who had grown up in a culture of duty and invincibility, the sight was like seeing a ghost that refused to die. Many Japanese pilots entered these later battles already burdened with fatalism. They flew with courage, but also with the awareness that the tide had shifted in ways their leaders refused to admit. It wasn't the enemy's skill that frightened them. It was the enemy's resilience. The Americans kept coming. And that persistence, mechanical, industrial, and human, broke the one thing Japanese training had never prepared them for: hopelessness. When Japanese intelligence officers assessed American industry before the war, they knew it was large, but they didn't understand its rhythm. The United States didn't just build ships, it manufactured them like products on an assembly line. By 1942, the American war machine had reached a pace the world had never seen. Factories in California, Virginia, and Michigan retooled overnight to produce naval aircraft and carrier components. Women filled the workshops. Steel, copper, and aluminum flowed by the ton from the Midwest to the coasts. The Essex-class carriers were designed not only for power, but for speed of production. While Japanese shipyards could build one large carrier in 2 or 3 years, the Americans could launch one in less than a year. By 1943, the U.S. Navy was commissioning new ships faster than Japan could even repair damaged ones. Every rivet, every bolt, every new plane that left the production line represented a form of strategic revenge for Pearl Harbor. The Americans understood that they couldn't outfight Japan in experience at first, but they could outbuild them, outfuel them, and outlast them. This technological imbalance became obvious in the Solomons campaign. When a Japanese carrier was damaged, it often limped home for months of repair. When an American carrier took hits, it was back in operation within weeks, sometimes patched on the move. Mobile repair bases, floating dry docks, and logistical ingenuity kept the U.S. Navy moving forward like a machine that refused to stop. Japanese aviators began to notice the pattern. Every time they thought they had struck a fatal blow, new ships appeared, often bearing the same names. It was as if the Americans had learned to resurrect their navy from steel and oil. In truth, they had, through sheer industrial will. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz understood something that Yamamoto never could. In modern war, perception was as powerful as firepower. After Midway, Nimitz knew that the U.S. Navy was still dangerously thin. Of the 3 carriers that fought there, Yorktown was sunk, Enterprise damaged, and Hornet not far from it. Yet, to the enemy, and even to his own men, Nimitz projected confidence. His strategy was simple: make the Japanese believe the U.S. carrier force was larger than it truly was. He rotated ships through repairs in record time, moved them strategically to create the illusion of multiple task forces, and used deception in communications to suggest strength where there was weakness. While Japan assumed it had time to recover, Nimitz refused to pause. He pushed his surviving carriers back into combat almost immediately. Enterprise and Hornet were supporting the Guadalcanal landings just 2 months after Midway. That move was risky, almost reckless. The U.S. could not afford another major carrier loss. But it worked. To Japanese reconnaissance, it seemed as though America had rebuilt its fleet overnight. To pilots in the air, the illusion became terrifyingly real. Even Yamamoto, analyzing reports from Rabaul and Truk, began to doubt his earlier assumptions. Were these truly the same carriers, repaired? Or had the Americans built new ones already? He couldn't be sure, and uncertainty is poison to command. Through calculated boldness, Nimitz turned fragility into psychological warfare. Every reappearance of an American flight deck over the horizon was a reminder to Japan that its enemy did not fight wars of pride, but of endurance. It was this philosophy, this quiet, relentless will, that changed the Pacific balance. Japan fought to win battles. The United States fought to win time. And time, as Nimitz knew, would do the rest. The return of the American carriers was not just a military event. It was a convergence of human shock, industrial momentum, and strategic deception. But on the other side of the ocean, the Japanese Empire still held one belief: that divine spirit could overcome material strength. That belief would soon be tested against the harsh mathematics of war. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the Pacific War with a doctrine shaped by 2 centuries of victory. From Tsushima to Pearl Harbor, Japan's military culture had been built on the principle that superior skill and spirit could overcome any numerical disadvantage. It was this belief that led Tokyo's admirals to underestimate not only American resolve, but their ability to adapt. After Midway, Japanese intelligence analysis bordered on wishful thinking. Reports of American losses were inflated, data cross-checked poorly, and reconnaissance interpreted through optimism rather than evidence. When Japanese pilots claimed to have sunk multiple carriers, staff officers in Tokyo took them at their word. The possibility that the enemy had survived or could return so soon was inconceivable. This blindness grew into a strategic illusion. While U.S. intelligence officers like Edwin Layton and Joseph Rochefort dissected Japanese communications with precision, Japan's own intelligence network faltered. Their reconnaissance flights were too few, their photographic analysis underdeveloped, and their chain of command too rigid to challenge assumptions. Even as American carriers reappeared in the Solomons, many Japanese analysts insisted they were misidentifying escort carriers or surface ships. To question the narrative of Japanese superiority was seen as defeatism, a moral failure rather than a professional correction. The cultural weight of Bushido, the warrior's code, left little room for doubt. Officers were trained to believe, not to question. In this environment, mistakes became self-reinforcing. False optimism led to poor planning led to disaster, and each disaster was cloaked in silence rather than studied. By the time reality began to break through, when pilots over Guadalcanal saw for themselves the reappearance of U.S. carriers, it was too late. Japanese perception of the war had been built on a fantasy, that their enemy was static, broken, predictable. The Americans had become the opposite, dynamic, adaptive, and unrelenting. The fog of war, Japan would learn, is not made of weather. It is made of pride. In the years before the war, Japanese officers were taught that industrial strength alone did not decide battles. Spirit did. The emperor's navy, they believed, fought with divine favor. Each pilot, each sailor, carried the legacy of samurai ancestors. A carrier could be rebuilt, but courage could not be manufactured. And here, Japan saw itself as eternally superior. At first, that belief seemed justified. At Pearl Harbor, Tarakan, Java, and the Indian Ocean, the Japanese Navy struck with precision and fury unmatched by any modern power. Western fleets crumbled before them. But by late 1942, that spiritual advantage began to meet an opponent it could not overcome: American mass production. The contrast was staggering. Japan's total steel output in 1942 was less than 1/5 of the United States. American shipyards launched vessels faster than Japan could design them. For every pilot Japan trained, America trained 6. For every carrier Japan launched, America built 3. And yet, Japanese soldiers and sailors continued to fight with total devotion. They wrote letters home with phrases like, "Even if I fall, others will rise." They believed their sacrifice would halt the American tide, that the Empire's divine spirit would compensate for its dwindling resources. But war, stripped of ideology, obeys only arithmetic. And arithmetic was no longer in Japan's favor. When Japanese pilots encountered the new American carriers, ships they believed destroyed, that arithmetic took on human form. The realization that their courage could not erase American steel, fuel, and manpower was devastating. To many, the reappearance of those carriers was not just a military shock, it was a moral wound. The enemy, once considered weak in spirit, had proven stronger in endurance. In the Solomon skies, amid clouds of tracer fire and burning oil, Japan's warriors began to sense a truth no code of honor could disguise: that faith without fuel could not win a modern war. As the Guadalcanal campaign intensified in late 1942, a strange rumor began to spread among Japanese aviators that the Americans possessed ghost carriers, ships that had been sunk at Midway but somehow rose again to fight. Reports from reconnaissance planes seemed to confirm the impossible. Pilots photographed the silhouette of the Enterprise again and again, a ship that, by all logic, should have been out of commission. They saw Hornet in places where it shouldn't have been, Saratoga reappearing after being torpedoed, Yorktown's sister ship fighting as though reborn. The Americans, without intending to, had created a kind of psychological warfare. Their ability to repair, redeploy, and replace carriers so quickly convinced many in the Japanese ranks that they were facing an enemy protected by fate, or something beyond human understanding. In truth, the illusion was forged not by mystery, but by organization. The U.S. Navy's repair yards at Pearl Harbor and Espiritu Santo operated around the clock. Damaged ships were patched in days, repainted, and sent back to sea. To Japanese intelligence, these reappearances looked supernatural, the same names returning again and again to the battlefield. That illusion began to eat away at morale. Veteran pilots who had once flown with confidence now wrote home of exhaustion, of facing an enemy that would not die. Superstitions spread through squadrons. Some claimed the Americans used decoy ships, Others whispered that U.S. carriers were protected by divine luck. But there was no ghost fleet, only a nation whose industry had become its armor. By the end of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy was not yet defeated, but it was rattled. The enemy they thought they understood had changed. America's power was not in its ships, but in its capacity to replace them faster than Japan could destroy them. And as Japanese pilots stared into the smoke-filled horizon, watching yet another destroyed carrier launch fresh aircraft, they began to understand that the war they were fighting was no longer one of heroes, but of machines. The illusion had shattered. But the breaking point, the moment when belief turned into despair, was still to come. That moment would arrive in the Solomons, where the Imperial Navy finally met the full force of America's reborn carrier fleet. August 1942. The dawn over the Solomon Islands broke heavy with mist, the sea beneath it glimmering like molten glass. Beneath the fog, the largest amphibious landing yet attempted by the United States Navy was underway, the invasion of Guadalcanal. It was here, on this humid stretch of jungle and coral, that the myth of Japanese naval supremacy would be tested for the first time since Midway. To the Americans, Guadalcanal was a foothold, a single, fragile step toward pushing Japan backward. To the Japanese, it was an insult. The island lay deep within their defensive perimeter, near bases at Rabaul and Truk, where the Imperial Navy had ruled unchallenged for months. And now, U.S. Marines were digging in on what Tokyo considered sacred territory. Admiral Yamamoto, furious, ordered an immediate response. Carrier task forces Shokaku and Zuikaku, survivors of Coral Sea, were dispatched south, along with Ryujo and Zuiho. Their mission: destroy the American invasion force and, above all, eliminate any remaining U.S. carriers. But what they found instead would rewrite Japan's understanding of the war, because waiting for them, hidden behind the humid haze and low clouds, were Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, the very ships Japanese intelligence had declared finished. When the first Japanese scout planes sighted them, their pilots hesitated to report. Surely it was a mistake. These were names from after-action reports, ships marked sunk or heavily damaged. Yet there they were, flight decks alive with motion, squadrons forming on the horizon, engines roaring in defiance. The radio transmissions that followed stunned Japanese commanders at Rabaul. 3 American carriers confirmed present. The ghosts had returned. At noon on August 24, 1942, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons began. It would be the first real carrier duel since Midway, and Japan AS attempt to prove that spirit could still triumph over steel. From Zuikaku's decks, waves of Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers and A-6M0 fighters rose into the clouds, streaking toward radar echoes on the horizon. But unlike in 1941, the Americans were ready. Their radar systems, crude by later standards but revolutionary in 1942, picked up the attack more than 70 miles out. Fighters from Enterprise and Saratoga scrambled to intercept. The sky became a storm of vapor trails and tracer fire. Japanese bombers dove through flak to strike the American carriers, scoring hits on Enterprise and Wasp, but the ships refused to die. Within hours, flight operations resumed. In contrast, the Japanese task force suffered a crippling blow. The light carrier Ryujo was hit repeatedly and sank by sunset, its crew watching helplessly as fires devoured the flight deck. The Shokaku took heavy damage and withdrew. By the battle's end, the Japanese had lost dozens of aircraft and some of their finest pilots, the very men who could least be spared. For the first time, American carriers had gone toe-to-toe with the Imperial Navy and held the field. To the Japanese airmen who survived, the battle was disorienting. They had fought hard, flown bravely, and struck true, yet the enemy endured. It felt unnatural, impossible. The belief that American ships could be sunk by sheer precision no longer held. Every hit was answered by repair crews, every loss by new aircraft. One Japanese pilot later described the experience in his log. "We damaged them, but they did not sink. They kept fighting. It was as if the sea itself carried them forward." That endurance, that refusal to die, became the hallmark of the U.S. Navy from this moment onward. Back in Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters struggled to process the reports. 4 American carriers spotted, 3 confirmed. Hadn't Yorktown been sunk, Hornet damaged, and Enterprise crippled? Hadn't the Americans needed a year to recover? The math no longer made sense. Yamamoto, hearing the situation, reportedly fell silent for several minutes before responding. If this is true, then the war has entered a new phase. He was right. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons was not a decisive American victory, but it marked something far greater, the moment Japan realized its enemy could replace ships faster than Japan could replace pilots. And yet, the true breaking point, the battle that would end Japan's last illusion of dominance, was still to come. It would arrive 2 months later in October 1942, when the Imperial Navy launched one final, desperate carrier assault in the waters east of the Santa Cruz Islands, a battle that would decide who truly ruled the skies of the Pacific. October 26, 1942. The dawn came blood-red over the South Pacific, the horizon glowing like the edge of a burning blade. From the decks of Shokaku and Zuikaku, Japan's finest aviators prepared for what they believed might be the decisive strike, the battle to reclaim the Pacific once and for all. They called it Operation Ka, the counterblow to drive the Americans from Guadalcanal and crush their carrier force. Yet in the misty pre-dawn light, as the flight crews secured bombs beneath their aircraft, few realized the scale of what was about to unfold. This would be a fight between 2 exhausted navies, but only one still had the industrial lungs to breathe. Across the sea, Enterprise, now the last fully operational U.S. carrier in the region, steamed eastward under constant strain. Her flight deck was patched from bomb scars. Her crew ran on coffee and nerves. Every man aboard knew they were outnumbered, yet they also knew retreat meant losing Guadalcanal, and perhaps the entire South Pacific. As dawn broke, both sides launched scouts almost simultaneously. Within an hour, radar screens aboard Enterprise began to flicker with returns. Enemy aircraft, multiple formations, closing fast. The battle began with eerie symmetry. Both fleets had found each other, both had committed to the attack. From Zuikaku, Captain Takatsugu Jojima ordered his strike force airborne, 21 Aichi D-3A VAL dive bombers, 20 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, and 21 Zeros for escort. Their formation stretched like a black wing across the morning sky. On Enterprise, alarms blared. Pilots scrambled from their ready rooms, clutching helmets and climbing into cockpits still slick with dew. At 09:45, the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared out of the clouds. Dive bombers peeled off, their screaming descent cutting through the roar of anti-aircraft guns. Enterprise took 3 direct hits. One bomb punched through her flight deck, detonating deep below in the machinery spaces. For a moment, it seemed the ship might not recover. Flames licked the island structure, men ran through smoke, hoses snaking across steel. And yet within minutes, the fires were under control. The damage control teams, drilled to near madness after Midway, worked like surgeons. The flight deck was cleared, aircraft refueled, and within half an hour, the Big E was launching her counterstrike. At the same time, American bombers found Shokaku. From 15,000 feet, dauntless dive bombers began their attack, and the Japanese carrier vanished beneath clouds of black flak. 3 bombs struck home, exploding across her flight deck. The ship listed, engulfed in fire. She was forced to withdraw. Her flight operations ended. By midday, the air above Santa Cruz was a swirling vortex of smoke, tracers, and falling debris. Both sides claimed victories. Both suffered grievous losses. For the Americans, Hornet, already damaged in earlier encounters, became the focus of Japanese fury. Struck by multiple bombs and torpedoes, she lost power and drifted helplessly. After repeated hits, the order was given to abandon ship. Japanese aircraft circled overhead as sailors plunged into the sea, their carrier burning like a floating volcano. But the Japanese triumph came at a terrible cost. Out of 199 aircraft launched that day, 99 were lost. More devastatingly, among the dead and missing were dozens of Japan's most experienced carrier pilots, men who had fought since Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway. It was a victory written in blood, not strategy. When Zuikaku recovered her remaining planes that evening, her deck crews fell silent. The returning pilots were few, some injured, many shaken. Several aircraft landed with empty cockpits. Their pilots had bailed out or been killed mid-air. The carrier's commander could only stare at the wreckage and whisper, "We have won, but there is no one left to fight again." In contrast, Enterprise, though battered, remained afloat. The Americans had lost Hornet, yes, but not their will. Within weeks, Enterprise would be patched up at Noumea and back at sea. And behind her, in shipyards from San Diego to Puget Sound, a new generation of Essex-class carriers was already taking shape. Each month that passed, new ships, new pilots, and new aircraft rolled off the American assembly lines. For Japan, every loss was irreplaceable. Every pilot gone was a lifetime of experience vanished into the ocean. By the end of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy still held vast territory, but its carrier arm, once the most formidable in the world, had been fatally wounded. The U.S. Navy had absorbed the blows, endured the fire, and learned. And as the year closed, one truth had become clear to both sides. Japan could no longer win through offense. From now on, the Pacific would belong to those who could endure, and the Americans, as the Japanese pilots had begun to whisper in disbelief, simply refused to die. By the start of 1943, the vast Pacific, once dominated by the red disk of the rising sun, had begun to change color. Japan still controlled immense stretches of territory: the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, much of New Guinea. But beneath the surface, a quiet collapse had begun. The Battle of Santa Cruz had given Tokyo one last victory to display in headlines, yet inside the Navy Ministry, few celebrated. The numbers told the truth. Out of nearly 200 aircraft launched, nearly half never returned. Many of those that did were riddled with holes or limped back to carriers low on fuel. Most of the men who had fought in the early Pacific campaigns were now gone. In the months after Santa Cruz, Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku would make fewer sorties. Their air groups were thin, their replacements barely trained. The elite strike groups, veterans of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, had been reduced to photographs on memorial walls. By contrast, America's industrial surge was becoming unstoppable. In January 1943, the first of the new Essex-class carriers entered service, USS Essex, CV-9. Behind her came Yorktown, Intrepid, Bunker Hill, Lexington, and more. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Navy would have 17 new fleet carriers and over 100 escort carriers. Japan, meanwhile, could not match even a fraction of this production. Its shipyards were bombed, its supply of steel dwindling, and its aviation fuel increasingly cut off by submarine blockades. The Americans had turned war into an equation of logistics. Every time a Japanese pilot took off, he gambled with the future of his navy. Every time an American pilot did, he knew there would be 10 more aircraft waiting when he returned. And yet, for all its crumbling strength, Japan refused to yield. When Shokaku and Zuikaku sailed again in 1943, their air groups were filled with 19-year-olds, boys who had practiced landings only a handful of times. Their instructors, once seasoned carrier aces, were now either dead or flying combat missions themselves. On the American side, the veterans of Midway and Santa Cruz became teachers. Flight schools across the U.S. swelled with trainees. By the time of the Marianas and Philippine Sea battles, the U.S. Navy would field tens of thousands of pilots, each rigorously trained in gunnery, navigation, and teamwork. The consequences of Santa Cruz rippled outward, strategically, psychologically, and technologically. Japan's carrier arm had not been destroyed outright, but its core, its human skill, had been gutted, and no amount of ships could restore that. In the months that followed, the Imperial Navy began shifting from offense to desperation defense. The next great test would come at the Solomon Islands, the grinding, attritional struggle that ended with Japan's evacuation of Guadalcanal in February 1943. From that moment, the initiative never returned. The Americans were learning the art of relentless warfare, repairing faster, producing faster, returning faster. The myth of invincible Japanese air power, which had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, was fading under waves of new American steel. But in Tokyo, the illusion persisted, that perhaps one more battle, one decisive strike, could still change the course of the war. It was a dream soon to be shattered over the Philippine Sea. By early 1943, the reality of war had finally settled over the Imperial Japanese Navy. The carriers that had once struck fear across the Pacific were now shadows of their former selves. Shokaku and Zuikaku survived, but they were weaker, their air groups inexperienced, their decks missing the aces who had once turned battles into victories. The human cost was staggering. Japanese records show that nearly 3,000 naval aviators had been killed or lost at sea during the Midway, Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz campaigns. Each pilot represented years of training, months of precision, and an irreplaceable tactical mind. Replacements were younger, less seasoned, and often sent into battle with minimal carrier experience. The skill gap widened every month. Meanwhile, America's losses, though significant, were rapidly absorbed. Enterprise, Essex, and Yorktown would continue operations after emergency repairs. Pilots lost in combat were replaced by graduates of newly expanded training programs. Aircraft production kept pace with attrition, allowing the U.S. Navy to maintain offensive capability across the Solomon Islands and beyond. Japan's material advantage was gone. The empire had once relied on speed, surprise, and superior experience to dominate the Pacific. Now, it faced overwhelming industrial capacity. For every Japanese carrier sunk or damaged, America could field 2 or 3 replacements in months. The psychological consequences mirrored the material ones. Japanese naval officers, once confident in the invincibility of their carriers, now approached missions with fear. Reports from the front lines described pilots hesitating at launch, worrying that another phantom fleet might appear unexpectedly. A literal embodiment of the American capacity to return ships once assumed lost. Even strategic doctrine had to shift. Japan moved from aggressive carrier operations to defensive patrols, attempting to protect supply lines and hold territory already captured. The initiative, once firmly in Japanese hands, had passed. Guadalcanal became the first visible sign that Japan could no longer dictate the terms of battle at sea. American commanders exploited this shift ruthlessly. Admiral Nimitz and his subordinates rotated carriers efficiently, staged landings with overwhelming support, and used intelligence, radar, and reconnaissance to project a near-constant presence across contested waters. The psychological edge Japan once held, the aura of invincibility, vanished. By mid-1943, the loss of experienced personnel had created a vacuum in Japanese leadership at sea. Young pilots flew older aircraft with limited support. Carrier air groups, once a tight-knit force of experts, became collections of novices and semi-trained replacements. Coordination faltered, Response times lagged, mistakes multiplied. Meanwhile, the Americans refined combined arms tactics, integrating carrier aviation with ground forces, submarines, and naval gunfire. Every reappearance of American carriers reinforced the lesson learned at Santa Cruz. Japan could not rely on courage alone to offset numerical and industrial disparity. The gap was no longer theoretical. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, would make it brutally clear Japan's carrier air arm had been destroyed beyond recovery. But the process began in these months after Midway and Santa Cruz, in the gradual erosion of pilots, carriers, and morale. Numbers, speed, and resilience had triumphed over skill, spirit, and tradition. Japan had underestimated the U.S. industrial engine. The Americans had underestimated nothing. And the reappearance of carriers, again and again, had been the first sign to Japanese pilots that the war would be measured not just in courage, but in the relentless ability to replace what was lost. By the end of 1943, the Pacific had irrevocably changed. Japan's ambition had shrunk to survival, while the Americans pressed forward, every carrier a reminder that the ocean was no longer theirs alone. The stage was set for the final tests of the Pacific War, a conflict where mastery of the seas would no longer belong to those who believed in invincibility, but to those who could endure. The story of the Pacific after Midway is not just a tale of ships and pilots. It is a lesson in resilience, adaptation, and the quiet arithmetic of war. Japanese carriers, once the unchallenged apex of naval power, were destroyed not only by bombs and torpedoes, but by the inexorable ability of their enemy to rebuild, repair, and return to fight. The Americans showed that industrial capacity, when coupled with strategy and determination, could overcome experience, training, and even morale. For the Japanese pilots who first saw the American carriers reappear after Midway, the experience was jarring. These were ships they believed sunk, fleets they believed erased. What they confronted was not magic or luck. It was an enemy capable of doing what they had never imagined, outlasting them. That revelation reshaped the psychological landscape of the war. Courage could no longer substitute for numbers. Skill could not replace steel. The reappearance of the U.S. carriers symbolized more than military recovery. It represented the awakening of a nation, a testament to logistics, industry, and unyielding resolve. Every aircraft launched from Enterprise or Saratoga carried with it the confidence of countless unseen workers in shipyards, factories, and training schools, a human machine as formidable as any combat vessel. For history, the lesson is clear. Midway may have been the turning point in terms of immediate losses, but it was the persistence afterward, the return of the carriers, the relentless push across the Solomons, that decided the Pacific. Warfare was no longer solely a test of skill or bravery. It had become a contest of endurance, strategy, and production. And for the Japanese Navy, the reappearing carriers became a mirror of inevitability. The enemy would continue again and again until the balance of power shifted irreversibly. The Pacific, once a domain of invincibility, became a theater where resilience triumphed over pride, and the ghost of lost ships taught a lesson that echoed across every naval deck, every pilot's cockpit, and every map in both Tokyo and Washington. In modern war, the capacity to endure is the ultimate weapon. The stage of the Pacific had changed forever, and the carriers that returned after Midway were the heralds of that new reality.